how could something so horrific, like the Holocaust, ever happen in what we think of as a civilized nation? It's just a massive question. So today we're going to do a deep dive into some sources that document alleged connections between Darwinian evolutionary ideas and the rise of Nazism and even other totalitarian movements. We're drawing from some pretty detailed articles, as one called The Darwinian Roots of the Nazi Tree, another on Darwinism and the Nazi race holocaust, and also some analyses looking at figures like Trotsky and Stalin. Our goal here is really to pull out the key insights from this material for you.
Absolutely. And we should frame this as an opportunity, really, to synthesize that information, to try and understand the why behind these huge historical events. We really want to encourage you, our listener, to think critically about how certain ideas, especially how they get interpreted and then applied, can really take hold and shape society, sometimes with just devastating results. The alleged intellectual foundations, how Darwinian ideas undermine traditional views.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. Our sources really emphasize the work of historian Richard Weikart, who documented these Darwinian roots of many Nazi principles. So what were these big shifts the sources talk about?
Well, one really striking argument you find in these materials is that certain interpretations of Darwinism directly challenge the whole idea of human uniqueness. And this, the sources argue, kind of started eroding the sanctity of life, creating what they call a slippery slope.
A slippery slope, meaning?
A dangerous path where devaluing one group could lead to devaluing others, where certain people could eventually be seen as, unworthy of life.
And it didn't stop there, right? The sources claim these interpretations also chipped away at any divine basis for ethics. So traditional morality gets pushed aside for what? Moral relativism.
Exactly. Moral relativism, the idea that right and wrong aren't fixed, they just depend. And evolutionary progress, however defined, that becomes the highest goal. So if you connect that dot, traditional Christian ideas, things like compassion for the sick, the handicapped, those are apparently dismissed as weak. Instead, you get this embrace of the strong dominating the weak. And even worse, it gets twisted into being somehow kind to eliminate the weak. It's chilling.
Wow. And this whole evolutionary fitness thing, it wasn't just individuals, was it? The sources say it was applied to whole groups, to races.
Yeah.
Weikart points out that before Darwin, racist ideas often ran up against the dominant Christian view that everyone came from Adam and Eve.
Right. So the question is, how did that shift? Well, according to these accounts, German Darwinian racists started saying, that darker races were somehow closer to apes than superior, lighter-skinned people. And a horrific early example cited of this thinking in action is the Herero genocide in Africa, way back in the early 1900s, the spread and application of these ideas in Germany.
So how did these ideas jump from academic discussions into the mainstream and then into actual Nazi policy? The sources talk about a highly branched line from Darwin to Hitler.
Yeah, they pinpoint Ernst Haeckel as a key figure. You might know him from the controversy over his forged embryo drawings. He was apparently very influential in popularizing Darwin's ideas among educated Germans. And Haeckel influenced people like Alfred Ploetz, who then founded the German Society for Race Hygiene, which our sources actually describe as the world's first eugenics organization.
Eugenics?
Yeah.
Just to be clear, that's the belief in improving humanity through controlled breeding, right?
That's right. Increasing desirable traits, eliminating undesirable ones. And this society, according to the sources, included some influential people.
Like Julius Lehmann,
Yeah.
a publisher, right? A racist eugenicist who published medical textbooks and apparently had extensive contact with Hitler from 1920.
Yes, him. And the sources also mention these ideas were already showing up in the press in Vienna back when Hitler lived there before World War I. So the ideas were spreading.
And then Hitler comes to power.
And Nazi propaganda really pushed these ideas hard. There's this specific example from a 1937 film, Victim of the Past. It apparently showed a disfigured, handicapped person. And the narration declared, and this is a quote the sources highlight, "Everything in the natural world that is weak for life will ineluctably be destroyed. Mankind has sinned terribly against the law of natural selection. We haven't just maintained life unworthy of life, we have even allowed it to multiply." It's pretty direct.
Chillingly direct. So, okay, beyond propaganda films, how did this translate into actual policy? What did they do?
Well, the sources state pretty clearly that top Nazis, Hitler included, genuinely believed you could improve the human gene pool through selective breeding, like farmers breed better cows.
The comparison again?
Yeah. And Hitler's government, these accounts say, leaned heavily on interpretations of Darwinism, especially the versions put forth by people like Spencer and Haeckel, to build their racial policies.
Which led to
A central policy of protecting the so-called superior race. That meant stopping inferior races from mixing to prevent contamination. This whole belief in a superior race, it was grounded in this idea of group inequality within each species, which the sources call a major presumption of Darwin's survival of the fittest concept.
and the end point of that logic, according to these sources.
Was the final solution. That's the connection they draw.
And it's even in Mein Kampf. Our sources mention Hitler writing in Chapter 4 that Darwinism was, quote, the only...
Well, what the sources emphasize is that for many involved, the key idea they took from Darwin wasn't just evolution itself, but selection, natural selection. And they believed they had to direct that process, to actively manage it to advance the human race.
So manage it how?
The first step described was isolation. Keep the inferior races separate to stop them from, quote, contaminating the Aryan gene pool. And apparently there was widespread support for this among the educated classes at the time, people who believed there was scientific proof for these genetically inferior races.
And this extended into something called the bad blood theory.
Yeah, the idea that bad blood, meaning undesirable genetics, would pollute a race line forever.
Which logically leads to...
Only extermination, in their view, could permanently get rid of these supposedly inferior genetic lines. It's a horrifying conclusion they reached.
And the list of who was deemed inferior just kept growing, didn't it?
It did. It started expanding. You see mentions of mental patients because of ideas about heredity, useless dredges, older people who weren't healthy, epileptics, people with mental disabilities, deaf mutes, even people with certain terminal illnesses. It also included people with features deemed Negroid or Mongoloid, gypsies, anyone who failed these bogus, racist phrenology tests.
Phrenology, measuring skulls.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the sources even bring up Hitler being angry that Jesse Owens, the black American athlete, was allowed to compete in the '36 Olympics in Berlin.
So it wasn't just about controlling who had children or eliminating groups.
Mm-hmm.
It also shaped how they viewed war itself.
Absolutely. The sources argue Darwinian thinking gave them a justification for future aggression. They looked back at, say, German military victories in the Bismarckian Wars and saw them as fitting neatly into Darwin categories, proof of strength, basically.
The war becomes...
a positive force, according to this view, because it supposedly eliminated weaker races and even weeded out the weaker members within the so-called superior races. Hitler apparently openly glorified war for this reason as a way to upgrade the race. There's that quote the sources use. He who would live must fight. He who does not wish to fight has not the right to exist. And they mention Haeckel again, praising the ancient Spartans for killing infants who weren't perfectly healthy and strong as a way to maintain vigor. 4. The conflict with religion and broader implications.
Okay, let's shift slightly. Our sources also talk quite a bit about the clash between Nazism and religion, particularly Christianity. They're presented as almost polar opposites.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point they raise. Apparently, much of the opposition to the eugenic movement actually came from German Christians. And the sources detail Hitler's own strong, even vociferous anti-Christian feelings, although, you know, he wasn't above trying to use the church for political gain when it suited him.
Right, and his right-hand man, Martin Bormann, was apparently even more blunt about it.
Very blunt. Bormann's quoted as saying Christianity was built upon the ignorance of men, whereas National Socialism was supposedly based on scientific foundations and had to follow the newest data of scientific researches.
Science versus ignorance, in their view.
Exactly. And connecting back to Haeckel again, the sources cite him arguing that the church, with its morality of love and charity, was basically a fraud and a perversion of the natural order.
Why perversion?
Because, Haeckel argued, Christianity makes no distinction of race or of color. It seeks to break down all racial barriers. And he saw this as opposing nature itself. He asks, essentially, aren't races the result of evolution? So isn't Christianity, therefore, anti-evolutionary?
Wow. Okay, so bringing this forward, what are the implications beyond Nazi Germany? Our sources draw lines to more contemporary figures, too.
They do. They mention atheistic philosophers like Peter Singer and James Rachels. According to these sources, they apply, quote, the same reasoning as the Nazis.
In a way.
The argument presented is that because they believe Darwinism has undermined the traditional sanctity of human life, things like involuntary euthanasia should be permissible, for instance, for severely disabled newborns.
That's a really strong claim the sources make. They also mention that the influence of Darwinism on the Holocaust has been sort of downplayed.
Yes, they state that the well-documented influence of Darwinism on the Holocaust has been greatly downplayed by the mass media, and that writers today often gloss over, totally ignore, or even distort this connection.
And the connections aren't limited to Nazism, right? The sources also link Darwinian thought to figures like Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin.
Right. Trotsky, for example, is described as having a fanatical faith in Marxism that was apparently reinforced by an uncritical acceptance of Darwinism. This supposedly led him to become an ardent atheist, advocate for an atheistic substitute for religion, and, well, persecute Christians.
Is there direct evidence cited?
They quote Trotsky himself, writing after reading Darwin in prison. He said, "Darwin destroyed the last of my ideological prejudices. I felt something like hard scientific ground under my feet. The idea of evolution and determinism took possession of me completely."
And Stalin. A similar story?
Very similar, according to these accounts. Reading Darwin while in seminary is said to have led him to atheism. And these Darwinian survival of the fittest ideas are presented as powerfully shaping his whole approach to society. The sources conclude that oppression, atheism, mass murder, these resulted from Stalin's rejection of religion after reading and believing Darwin's evolutionary ideas. Outro.
So after digging into all this, what's the takeaway for us today, for you, the listener, grappling with these sources? I mean, it feels like a really stark warning from history about how ideas get used, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. The sources frame it in very stark terms. They suggest that if you assume Darwinism is true, then you could theoretically see someone like Hitler as a kind of modern savior trying to lift the human race evolutionarily.
Which is a deeply disturbing thought.
Deeply. But then they flip it. If Darwinism isn't true, then Hitler's actions become the most heinous crimes of history, and Darwin himself is presented as the father of one of the most destructive philosophies of history. It's a provocative conclusion they reach.
It really forces you to confront the power of ideas and maybe how they can be interpreted or misinterpreted, sometimes with world-altering consequences.
Exactly. And it underscores that point about critical thinking, doesn't it? Especially now, with so much information swirling around, you have to really question where ideas come from and where they might lead. What part of this deep dive stands out most to you? What are you left thinking about?